Have you ever noticed how the biggest turning points in life rarely begin outside of us, but somewhere quiet in the mind? I used to think happiness, peace, even strong relationships were mostly shaped by circumstances. But the deeper you look, the more something surprising appears. The thoughts we repeat, the attitudes we hold, the images we carry inside those invisible patterns quietly shape everything. So let's take a slow walk through a few ideas about love, happiness, fear, forgiveness, and the strange power hidden in the way we think. One of the quiet mistakes people make in marriage begins with a thought that sounds innocent enough. If only they were a little more like me. It rarely starts with bad intentions. Most of the time, it begins with love, hope, and a sincere desire to make life better. But somewhere along the way, that gentle wish quietly turns into a mission. And before long, one partner begins trying to reshape the other into a second version of themselves. That's where the trouble begins. Because no human being was meant to be a copy of someone else. The moment one person tries to remake another in their own image, something fragile begins to crack beneath the surface. Pride is wounded, self-respect begins to shrink, and a quiet resistance starts to grow where warmth used to live. At first, it may show up in small ways. A comment here, a suggestion there. You should think about things this way. Why don't you try being more like this? It may even be disguised as helpful advice. But if that pattern continues, the message eventually becomes clear to the other person who you are is not enough. And that realization can be deeply painful, because every person carries a natural desire to feel accepted as they are. When that acceptance disappears, it often awakens something stubborn inside the human spirit. Instead of becoming closer, the two people slowly begin pulling in opposite directions. What began as an effort to improve the marriage ends up quietly weakening it. You can almost picture it like someone trying to force a flower to bloom by pulling at the petals. The more you tug, the more you damage the very thing you hoped would grow. And that's why the attempt to remake a spouse so often leads to resentment. Not because people are unwilling to grow. Growth is natural. Adjustment is part of every relationship. Two lives coming together will always require some shifting, some learning, some softening around the edges. But growth cannot be forced from the outside. Real change only happens when it rises naturally from within a person. And when someone feels respected and valued, that change often happens without anyone demanding it. Now here's the interesting twist that many people eventually discover. The one person we almost never try to change is ourselves. It's much easier to see the faults in someone else than it is to look quietly inward. Much easier to say, if they would just improve this, than to ask, what in me might need refining? But if someone truly takes a sincere look at their own character, their own habits, their own moods, they usually discover something humbling. There is more than enough work there to last a lifetime. Patience to develop, kindness to deepen, understanding to expand, old reactions to soften, words to choose more carefully. And once that process begins, something beautiful often happens. The energy that once went toward criticizing the other person begins flowing into personal growth instead. The home becomes less about correction and more about understanding. Instead of trying to mold someone else, the focus shifts toward becoming the best partner possible. And strangely enough, when that happens, the relationship often improves on its own. Because kindness tends to invite kindness. Respect awakens respect. And appreciation has a quiet way of bringing out the best in another person. There's an old idea that captures this beautifully: pray together, stay together. Now that phrase isn't really about ritual, it's about alignment. It's about two people pausing long enough to remember that their relationship isn't built only on shared bills, responsibilities, and routines. It's built on something deeper: shared intention, shared goodwill, shared spiritual direction. And that direction begins with the smallest daily habits. One of the most powerful is surprisingly simple: do not carry yesterday's irritations into tomorrow. Little disappointments happen in every relationship. A sharp word spoken too quickly, a misunderstanding, a moment when someone feels overlooked. If those tiny sparks are allowed to pile up day after day, they eventually turn into something much heavier. What began as small friction quietly becomes emotional distance. But imagine a different practice. Before going to sleep each night, each partner chooses to release the day's irritations, not pretending nothing happened, but consciously letting go of the emotional charge. Forgiveness becomes a nightly clearing of the air. Two people going to rest without carrying resentment into the next morning. That single habit can transform the emotional atmosphere of a home. And then comes the morning. The moment when a new day begins. Instead of waking up and immediately rushing into worries, schedules, and unfinished conversations, there's a quiet pause. A moment of inward direction. The mind turns toward guidance, toward wisdom greater than the immediate frustrations of the day. And from that place, loving thoughts are sent outward. To a partner, to the family, to the home itself. Thoughts of peace, thoughts of harmony, thoughts of goodwill. It may sound simple, almost too simple, but the tone of a relationship is often set by the mental atmosphere surrounding it. When two people begin their day with goodwill rather than irritation, the entire emotional climate of the home shifts. Then comes something even more ordinary, the breakfast table. Now, most people wouldn't think of a meal as something spiritually important, but shared meals carry more influence than we realize. They're one of the few times each day when people sit together without rushing from one obligation to another. And what happens during those moments matters. Instead of letting the table become a place for arguments, worries, and tension, it can become a space for gratitude. A simple pause to give thanks. Thanks for the food, for the home, for the resources that sustain the family. And gratitude has an interesting effect on the human mind. It shifts attention away from what's missing and toward what's present. From complaints toward appreciation. Imagine a household where meals begin not with complaints about the day ahead, but with quiet acknowledgement of the blessings already there. The tone of the entire day begins differently, and the same spirit can continue into the evening meal as well. Instead of discussing only problems and frustrations, partners make a conscious effort to express appreciation to one another. Something as simple as saying, "I appreciate what you're doing," or "Thank you for the way you support our life together." Those words may seem small, but appreciation is nourishment for the human heart. Many people who appear difficult, critical, or distant are actually carrying a quiet hunger for recognition. They want to know their effort matters. They want to feel valued. And when appreciation flows regularly through a relationship, it softens the emotional edges between two people. Another gentle practice is alternating moments of prayer or reflection together in the evening. Not as a rigid obligation, but as a shared moment of connection. Two people acknowledging something greater than themselves guiding their lives. In those moments, they remember that their partnership isn't simply about solving daily problems. It's about building something lasting, a home rooted in love, in beauty, in harmony, in mutual respect, in faith that goodness ultimately governs their shared journey. And when those ideas become the foundation of a relationship, the home begins to feel different. Peace becomes easier to maintain. Conflicts lose some of their intensity. The bond between the two people deepens beyond the surface level of daily disagreements. Even spiritual reading before sleep can become part of this rhythm, turning the mind toward higher truths before entering rest. Because the last thoughts we hold before sleep often sink deeply into the subconscious mind. And when those thoughts are filled with peace, trust, and goodwill, they quietly shape the emotional landscape of the relationship over time. Marriage, after all, isn't something maintained through grand gestures alone. It's built through hundreds of small daily choices. Choices to forgive, to appreciate, to speak kindly, to release pride, to send love where irritation once lived. And perhaps the most powerful realization in all of this is surprisingly freeing. There is only one person any of us truly has the power to change: ourselves. But when one person begins practicing patience, appreciation, and goodwill, consistently, something remarkable tends to happen. The other person often responds, not because they were forced, but because love has a natural way of calling love forth. And slowly, almost quietly, the relationship begins to resemble what many people hope for when they first stand together and promise a life side by side. A partnership where two people grow, not by reshaping each other, but by bringing out the best within one another. There is a moment in almost every person's life when they pause and quietly ask themselves a question they may not say out loud. It usually appears in the middle of ordinary days while driving somewhere, while sitting alone after a long evening, or maybe after achieving something that once seemed incredibly important. The question is simple, but it carries weight. Why does happiness feel so temporary? Think about it for a moment. There are experiences that bring genuine joy. The birth of a child. The day someone graduates after years of effort. A wedding day filled with laughter and hope. A victory after months or years of work. These moments feel radiant. They lift the heart and create memories that stay with us for a lifetime. And yet something curious happens after the celebration fades. The emotion that once filled the entire world slowly settles down again. Life returns to its ordinary rhythm. Bills still arrive. Problems still appear. The mind drifts back toward worries, plans, and unfinished thoughts, which raises a deeper question. If happiness comes from events alone, why does it fade so quickly? Many people spend years chasing an answer to that question without realizing it. They assume the solution must be somewhere outside themselves. Maybe happiness will come when they earn a little more money, when they finally get the promotion, when they buy the house they've always wanted, when they reach a certain level of recognition, when the world finally gives them the success they feel they deserve. But if you observe life closely, you start noticing something fascinating. There are people with enormous wealth who are restless, anxious, and dissatisfied. And there are people with very little who seem surprisingly peaceful. There are individuals who reach positions of influence and prestige, yet still carry a sense of emptiness. And there are others living quiet lives who radiate contentment that feels almost contagious. So clearly, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. It suggests that happiness does not simply arrive when circumstances become perfect. In fact, circumstances rarely become perfect. Instead, happiness seems to emerge from a different source entirely. It begins inside the mind. This may sound simple, almost too simple, but the mind is where happiness actually takes shape. And that realization changes everything. Because once you understand that happiness begins as a mental condition, you begin to see how much influence you truly have over it. The mind constantly chooses where to rest its attention. Some people wake up each morning and immediately begin rehearsing everything that could go wrong. The traffic will be terrible. The meeting will be difficult. The economy is unstable. The day will probably be exhausting. Without realizing it, they are programming the emotional tone of the day before the day has even started. The mind quietly gathers evidence to support whatever expectation it holds. If someone begins the morning expecting frustration, the mind naturally notices every small irritation that appears. The delayed train, the rude comment, the unexpected bill, each one confirms the original belief that the day would be unpleasant. But there is another way to begin the day, a quieter, more intentional approach. Before stepping into the rush of activity, a person pauses for a moment and directs their mind deliberately. Instead of letting the first thoughts drift toward worry, they choose something different. They say, in essence, today will unfold in a positive way. Today is a new day. There has never been another day exactly like this one, and there never will be again. That simple shift may seem small, but the mind responds powerfully to the direction it is given. When someone begins the morning expecting harmony, guidance, and success, the mind starts searching for opportunities instead of obstacles. It becomes easier to notice helpful conversations, creative ideas, moments of kindness, unexpected advantages that might otherwise have been overlooked. In other words, the mind begins cooperating with the expectation of good. This is one of the most important ideas about happiness. Happiness is not just an emotional reaction. It is a mental habit. And like any habit, it becomes stronger through repetition. Think of the farmer who wakes before sunrise each morning and walks through his fields. You might imagine him humming softly, greeting the day with a sense of quiet gratitude. Perhaps someone once asked him the secret of his cheerful spirit, and instead of offering a complicated explanation, he simply said something like, "This being happy has become my habit." Every morning he blesses the things around him, the land, the animals, the people he loves. Every evening he does the same before resting. After years of repeating that mental attitude, happiness has carved a deep path inside his mind. Just like a river gradually forms a channel through the landscape, repeated thoughts form channels within consciousness. Over time, those channels become the natural direction the mind flows. That's why happiness can truly become a habit. But there is an important condition. A person must sincerely want to be happy. This might sound obvious, yet it reveals something many people overlook. Some individuals have spent so long living with disappointment, resentment, or pessimism that those feelings begin to feel familiar, even comfortable in a strange way. They wake up expecting frustration, and when it appears, it feels almost normal. The mind says, "See, I knew it would happen." But when something unexpectedly positive occurs, they may actually feel uneasy. It doesn't match the emotional pattern they have grown used to. There are people who have been surrounded by sadness or complaint for so many years that genuine happiness feels unfamiliar. They may even believe that happiness is suspicious, temporary, or undeserved. So they return often unconsciously to the mental patterns they know best. This is why the desire for happiness must be sincere. It cannot simply be a passing wish. It must be a genuine decision, a quiet commitment to direct the mind toward what is life-giving rather than draining. One of the most powerful teachings about this idea appears in an ancient piece of wisdom that encourages people to dwell on whatever is true, whatever is honest, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, and whatever is worthy of praise. Think about that guidance for a moment. It does not say to ignore reality or pretend that difficulties do not exist. Life will always contain challenges. But it does suggest that the mind has the freedom to choose what it focuses on most often. The world is filled with both beauty and chaos, with kindness and cruelty, with generosity and selfishness. The direction of your thoughts determines which side of that reality becomes most powerful in your experience. If someone constantly feeds their mind with criticism, worry, and resentment, those thoughts eventually shape their emotional life. But if the mind regularly returns to thoughts of goodness, possibility, and gratitude, those thoughts gradually build a different emotional landscape, and that landscape is where happiness grows. There is another quiet truth hidden inside this idea. The outer world does not control the inner world as much as we assume. Two people can experience the same event and react in completely different ways. One sees opportunity, the other sees disappointment. One finds meaning, the other feels cheated. The event itself may be identical, but the interpretation transforms the experience. This is why the mind holds such tremendous influence over happiness. It interprets reality continuously, and interpretation shapes emotion. There is an old philosophical observation that captures this beautifully. A person's life is largely what their thoughts make of it. If the mind constantly repeats ideas such as, "Nothing ever works out for me," or "Everyone is against me," or "Things will probably get worse," those thoughts eventually begin attracting experiences that seem to confirm them. Not because the universe is cruel, but because the mind filters reality through its expectations. Negative expectations often create negative interpretations, and those interpretations create emotional suffering. But when someone learns to guide their thoughts differently, the results can be surprising. The same world begins to look different. The same circumstances reveal new possibilities, and the mind slowly learns a new habit: happiness. It begins with small choices. When the morning starts, the person consciously chooses a constructive attitude. When worry begins to wander into the mind, they gently redirect attention towards something more uplifting. When gratitude appears, they pause long enough to feel it fully. Over time, these choices become easier. The mind begins cooperating with the pattern of optimism rather than resistance. And happiness becomes less dependent on circumstances. It becomes something that grows from within. That does not mean life will always be easy. It simply means the mind becomes stronger than temporary conditions. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. Happiness is not something waiting at the end of a long road. It is something that begins right where you are, in the quiet direction of your thoughts, in the willingness to choose what uplifts rather than what diminishes, and in the simple but powerful decision made again and again each morning. Today I will choose happiness. there is a quiet law operating in human relationships that many people never fully notice, even though they experience it every single day. It shows up in the way conversations feel in the atmosphere of a workplace, in the tension between strangers, and in the warmth between friends. And the strange part is that it often has less to do with what people say out loud, and far more to do with what they silently think about one another. If you watch closely, you begin to see that every relationship has two layers. There is the visible layer, the words spoken, the actions taken, the smiles, the disagreements, the ordinary exchanges of daily life. But beneath that, there is another layer almost invisible, yet incredibly powerful. It is the layer of thought and feeling, the attitudes we hold inside toward the people around us. And that inner layer has a remarkable influence over what happens in the outer one. For centuries, people have repeated a simple principle often called the golden rule. It usually appears in a form like this: treat others the way you would like to be treated. Most people understand this idea as guidance for behavior. Be fair, be kind, be respectful. But there is a deeper side to it that many people overlook. The rule does not only apply to actions, it applies to thought itself. The way you think about another person, the quiet conclusions you reach about their character, the feelings you rehearse when you imagine them, the inner tone you carry when their name appears in your mind, those thoughts do not simply remain private. They influence the entire relationship. In a very real way, what you think and feel about another person becomes part of the experience you create with them. Imagine two coworkers walking into the same office building on the same morning. One enters with a quiet suspicion about everyone around them. They believe the people in the office are selfish, competitive, and ready to undermine them if given the chance. As they greet others in the hallway, their tone may be polite enough, but underneath the words, there is a subtle tension, a guardedness, a readiness to interpret every remark as criticism or hidden rivalry. The other coworker enters the same building with a different inner attitude. They assume that most people, despite their imperfections, are simply trying to do their work and move through the day as best they can. They expect cooperation more than conflict. They expect goodwill more than hostility. Now here's the fascinating part. Both individuals may be working with the same group of people, yet their daily experience of the workplace will feel completely different. One will continually notice small irritations, signs of competition, hints of disrespect. The other will notice moments of cooperation, shared effort, and occasional kindness. The outer environment has not changed, but the inner lens through which each person views it has transformed the experience. This is the psychological meaning behind the golden rule when it reaches into thought. Your mind is not just a place where reactions happen. It is a creative medium. It is constantly interpreting and shaping how life unfolds around you. When someone repeatedly entertains thoughts of resentment toward another person, imagining their faults, rehearsing arguments in their head, building silent cases against them, those thoughts do not remain harmless mental events. They act almost like a subtle poison. Not because the other person necessarily hears them, but because the thinker carries that emotional atmosphere everywhere they go. Resentment shows up in tone of voice, in body language, in the tiny pauses and expressions that slip out during conversation. And people are surprisingly sensitive to these signals, even when they cannot explain exactly what they are noticing. That is why negative inner speech can quietly shape the reactions you receive from others. Consider the person who spends their commute each morning mentally arguing with their boss. They replay past conversations, adding sharper words they wish they had said. They imagine the boss as unfair, stubborn, even hostile. By the time they arrive at the office, their emotional state is already tense. And when the boss greets them, the response is filtered through that tension. Perhaps the boss responds curtly that day or appears impatient. The employee immediately sees confirmation of their earlier belief. But the employee rarely realizes that the entire interaction has been influenced by the emotional climate they carried into it. Inner speech. The conversations we have silently in our own minds has tremendous influence over human relationships. Many people underestimate this because the words are never spoken aloud, yet they carry emotional force. They shape the expressions we show to others, and over time, those expressions shape how people respond to us. When someone repeatedly criticizes another person in their thoughts, they gradually condition themselves to experience more conflict with that individual. But when someone intentionally changes the tone of their inner speech, something interesting begins to happen. Imagine a worker who has struggled for years with a difficult supervisor. Every day they complain inwardly about the boss's temperament, the unfair treatment, the lack of recognition. Eventually, they reach a moment of insight. They realize that while they cannot control another person's behavior, they can control their own mental attitude. So they begin experimenting with a different inner approach. Instead of rehearsing criticism, they deliberately wish the supervisor well. They picture the supervisor succeeding in their responsibilities. They mentally acknowledge the possibility that the person is under pressures they do not fully understand. This does not mean pretending the situation is perfect. It simply means changing the mental posture from hostility to goodwill. Over time, the emotional tone of the relationship shifts. The worker speaks more calmly, listens more patiently, responds without the sharp edge of accumulated resentment, and gradually the supervisor responds differently as well. What once felt like constant friction begins to soften. This kind of shift may sound almost mysterious, but it is actually very practical. People constantly react not only to our words, but to the emotional signals behind those words. When hostility disappears from our thoughts, it often disappears from the interaction as well. Another example appears in a surprising place: the stage. Imagine an actor who once had a humiliating experience with an audience. Perhaps they performed poorly during an early appearance and heard people booing from the crowd. That memory can create a powerful emotional imprint. If the actor begins thinking of audiences as hostile, ignorant, or cruel, those thoughts create tension every time they step onto the stage. The performer becomes stiff, defensive, nervous, and the audience senses it. But suppose the actor decides to change their inner attitude. Before each performance, they spend a moment sending goodwill toward the people who will be watching. They imagine the audience enjoying the show, feeling inspired, leaving the theater uplifted. Suddenly, the emotional atmosphere of the performance changes. The actor walks on stage with warmth instead of fear, and the audience responds with enthusiasm rather than suspicion. The outer success began with an inner adjustment. This principle becomes even more important when dealing with difficult personalities. Every workplace, family, or community contains individuals who seem constantly argumentative, negative, or critical. Their attitudes can easily provoke frustration. The natural reaction is to meet irritation with irritation. But emotional maturity introduces another possibility. It asks a simple question: must I allow another person's behavior to control my emotional state? The truth is that another person's words cannot disturb you unless you accept the disturbance internally. Think about the stages that happen inside the mind when someone becomes angry. First, a remark is heard. Then the mind interprets the remark. Then it decides whether to take offense. Then it generates the emotional reaction. Only after those stages does the visible reaction appear. In other words, the emotional response is not forced upon you from the outside. It is constructed inside the mind. When someone becomes aware of this process, they gain a powerful form of freedom. They realize that criticism, disagreement, or rudeness does not automatically have to produce anger. The mind can choose a different response. It can simply observe the remark and let it pass, or respond calmly without joining the emotional turbulence of the other person. This is the essence of emotional maturity. Not suppressing emotion, but understanding that you are not required to mirror every emotional wave that reaches you. When you refuse to descend into someone else's negativity, you maintain your own inner balance. That balance often has a surprising effect. The person who expected conflict suddenly finds themselves facing calmness instead, and conflict loses its fuel. There is also another important dimension to healthy relationships: empathy. Empathy is the ability to momentarily step inside another person's perspective, to imagine what life feels like from their side. Many conflicts arise because people see only their own interpretation of events. They assume their view is the complete picture. But when someone pauses long enough to consider the emotional world of the other person, something begins to shift. the mind becomes less rigid, more understanding, even compassionate. Perhaps the coworker who seemed hostile is struggling with private stress. Perhaps the friend who appeared distant is carrying worries they have not shared. Perhaps the person who reacts sharply has been shaped by experiences that left them defensive. Empathy does not excuse harmful behavior, but it softens the impulse to respond with judgment. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with this person?" the mind asks, "What might this person be experiencing?" That single shift can transform many interactions. Of course, compassion does not mean allowing others to manipulate or control you. Kindness does not require surrendering your boundaries. Some individuals attempt to gain their way through emotional pressure, anger, tears, dramatic complaints, or demands that others submit to their wishes. Yielding to such tactics rarely creates healthy relationships. It often encourages the behavior to continue. The wiser approach is firmness combined with kindness. You remain respectful, but you refuse to abandon what you know is right. You do not retaliate with hostility, yet you do not surrender your self-respect either. This balanced kindness without weakness, firmness without cruelty, is the foundation of strong human relations. And it begins in the same place as everything else we have discussed, inside the mind. Because every thought you entertain about another person eventually shapes your interaction with them. Every silent judgment leaves a trace in your emotional tone. Every act of goodwill quietly strengthens the possibility of harmony. When someone truly understands this, their relationships begin to change, not because the world suddenly becomes perfect, but because they have discovered something powerful. They are the only thinker in their own mental universe. And once that realization settles in, the golden rule becomes more than advice for behavior. It becomes a guide for thought itself. Think about others with fairness, with goodwill, with understanding. And slowly, often almost invisibly, the atmosphere of your relationships begins to reflect those same qualities back to you. There comes a moment in many lives when the real battle is no longer happening out in the world, but quietly inside the mind. It often begins after something painful has happened: a betrayal, a mistake, a broken relationship, a harsh criticism, a memory that refuses to fade. At first, the mind tries to make sense of what happened. It searches for explanations. It replays conversations. It asks why. But over time, something heavier can begin to form: resentment, guilt, condemnation, sometimes directed at another person, sometimes directed inward, and sometimes even directed toward life itself. Yet what many people never realize is that these emotional patterns create a kind of resistance inside the mind. They block the natural movement of peace, clarity, and healing that life is constantly trying to express. Because life itself is restorative. You can see this principle everywhere. If you accidentally cut your finger, something remarkable happens. You do not have to consciously instruct the body to repair the wound. The intelligence of life within you immediately begins the work. Cells rebuild. Tissue regenerates. The injury gradually disappears. The same thing happens if you eat something harmful. The body responds by protecting you, sometimes even rejecting what could cause damage. Life is always working to restore balance. It does not hold grudges. It does not say, "You made a mistake, therefore you must remain wounded forever." Instead, it moves continuously toward healing and renewal. But when the mind holds tightly to resentment, guilt, or condemnation, it interferes with that natural flow. Imagine trying to grow a healthy garden while constantly pouring poison into the soil. No matter how fertile the ground might be, the growth will struggle. The same thing happens inside the mind. Negative emotional patterns become a kind of congestion in the inner life. They keep old wounds alive. They replay painful memories over and over again. And the person begins to live in a state of emotional tension that slowly drains energy and peace. This is why forgiveness becomes so important, not as a moral rule imposed from outside, but as a psychological necessity for inner freedom. Yet forgiveness is widely misunderstood. Many people believe it means excusing wrongdoing or pretending something painful never happened. But real forgiveness is something very different. It is the decision to release the emotional burden connected to the event. to stop carrying the injury forward into the future, to allow the mind to become free again. And perhaps most importantly, forgiveness begins with understanding. There are people who spend years blaming life for their suffering. They blame God for loss, illness, accidents, or misfortune. They imagine that some external force has singled them out for hardship. But this perspective often creates even more emotional resistance. Because when someone believes life itself is against them, they carry a quiet hostility toward existence. That hostility keeps the mind in a constant state of struggle. The deeper truth is that life itself does not operate through punishment or revenge. Instead, it responds to the patterns we hold in thought and feeling. When destructive ideas dominate the mind, anger, hatred, resentment, those ideas create suffering within the individual experiencing them. Not because life is punishing them, but because the mind is generating conditions that cannot produce peace. Once someone begins to understand this, a new possibility appears. They realize they are not helpless victims of their past experiences. They can change their inner response. And with that change, healing begins. Consider the story of a man who once carried an enormous burden of guilt. For years, he worked endlessly, staying late into the night, pushing himself far beyond what was healthy. On the surface, it appeared he was simply dedicated to his career. But beneath that behavior was something else. He was unconsciously punishing himself. Earlier in life, he had wronged someone close to him, a brother. The memory of that mistake stayed buried inside his mind, creating a constant sense of guilt he could not escape. Even after the brother had passed away, the emotional weight remained. And without realizing it, the man believed he deserved to suffer. That belief shaped his entire life. The endless work, the stress, the declining health, the feeling that he could never truly rest. Yet when he was finally confronted with a simple question, something began to change. Would you do the same thing again today? His answer came immediately. No. He had grown. He had learned. He had become a different person. And in that moment, he realized something important. The man who committed that mistake no longer truly existed. Years of experience had transformed him. Yet he was still condemning himself for the actions of someone he used to be. Once he understood this, the burden of guilt began to lift. Self-forgiveness entered where condemnation had lived. And with it came a surprising improvement in his health and peace of mind. Another man once carried a different kind of burden. Many years earlier, in a moment of intense anger, he had committed a terrible act. The consequences haunted him for decades. Even though he had since built a new life, helped others, and become a caring father, he could not escape the belief that he deserved punishment. His mind kept returning to the past, judging him again and again. But eventually he came to see that physically, mentally, and spiritually, he was no longer the same person who committed that act. Every cell in his body had changed over time. His understanding of life had deepened. His character had evolved. Yet his mind was still condemning him for a past self that no longer existed. That realization became a turning point. He began to accept that growth is real, that people can transform, and that holding on to endless self-condemnation only prolongs suffering without serving any constructive purpose. Once he released that judgment, the emotional torment faded. A deep sense of relief replaced it. These examples reveal something essential about forgiveness. It does not erase the past, but it transforms your relationship to it. Instead of allowing old events to dominate your emotional life, you place them where they belong, in memory, but no longer in control. There is another situation where forgiveness becomes especially important. When someone receives criticism. Imagine a teacher who gives a public presentation and later receives a letter pointing out several flaws in the speech. The writer says the delivery was too fast, certain words were unclear, and the overall structure needed improvement. The teacher's first reaction might be anger, embarrassment, defensiveness. After all, criticism can sting. But once the initial emotion passes, the teacher pauses and reflects. Are the observations true? If they are, then the criticism becomes valuable information rather than an attack. Instead of resenting the person who wrote the letter, the teacher uses the feedback to improve speaking skills. In fact, the teacher even writes back expressing appreciation for the insight. That response demonstrates emotional maturity. It shows the difference between reacting defensively and responding thoughtfully. But even when criticism is unfair, the same principle applies. If someone lashes out with negative remarks, it often reveals more about their own emotional state than about the person they criticize. Understanding this allows the mind to remain calm rather than reactive. Compassion replaces resentment. Because once you realize that a person speaking from bitterness is likely suffering internally, it becomes easier to wish them peace rather than retaliation. And this leads to the deeper meaning of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not merely forgetting an injury. It is actively releasing it. It means allowing the other person to move forward in life without carrying your hostility toward them. And it means freeing yourself from the emotional prison created by resentment. One of the simplest ways to practice forgiveness is through a quiet mental decision. A person sits quietly and acknowledges the situation that caused pain. Then they deliberately release it. They say inwardly something like this: I release you from this situation. I wish you peace. I wish you happiness. I wish you all the blessings of life. At first, the words may feel mechanical, but repeated sincerely, they begin to soften the emotional tension connected to the memory. Gradually, the mind stops replaying the injury. The emotional charge fades, and peace returns. But how can someone know when forgiveness is truly complete? There is a simple test. Imagine hearing good news about the person who once hurt you. Perhaps they received a promotion. Perhaps their life has improved in some meaningful way. If the mind immediately reacts with bitterness or irritation, it means the wound has not yet healed. The resentment is still alive beneath the surface. But if the mind can hear the news without anger, perhaps even with genuine goodwill, then forgiveness has taken place. The memory remains, but the sting is gone. Just like an old physical injury that once caused pain, but has since healed completely. You may remember that it happened, but it no longer hurts. That is the real measure of forgiveness, the absence of the old sting. When someone reaches that point, they experience something extraordinary: freedom. Freedom from emotional chains that once tied them to the past. Freedom from the exhausting cycle of resentment and blame. And perhaps most importantly, freedom to allow life's natural healing power to flow through the mind again. Because life is always moving toward restoration. And when the mind finally releases the weight of guilt, resentment, and condemnation, it discovers something beautiful waiting underneath: peace. Every once in a while, a person runs into a problem that feels strangely immovable. Not dramatic on the surface, perhaps maybe it's a habit they can't seem to break, a pattern that keeps repeating, or a quiet sense that something inside is holding them back. They try willpower, they make promises, they swear that this time will be different. And for a short while it is. But then the old pattern returns. And that's when the deeper question begins to emerge. Why do certain behaviors feel almost automatic, as if something beneath the surface keeps pulling the mind back into the same direction? To understand that question, it helps to look at the way habits are actually formed. Most of what we do in life eventually becomes habitual. Think about learning to swim or ride a bicycle or drive a car. In the beginning, every movement requires attention. The mind has to concentrate on balance, timing, direction. But after enough repetition, the activity begins to feel natural. The body responds almost automatically. What happened during that process is something subtle but powerful. The repeated action carved a track inside the deeper levels of the mind. Once that track is formed, the mind begins following it with very little effort. Habits work the same way. When a person repeats a thought or behavior over and over again, the subconscious gradually accepts it as a pattern. And once the pattern becomes established, it begins operating almost like an automatic program. That's why someone who has developed a destructive habit often feels trapped by it. They may sincerely want to change, but the pattern has already been rehearsed so many times that it continues to pull the mind in the same direction. Yet here is the encouraging truth. If a habit can be formed through repetition, it can also be replaced through repetition. The same mechanism that built the old track can build a new one. But this change does not begin with force. It begins with imagination. Many people think imagination is just a form of daydreaming, something separate from real life. But imagination has a direct influence on the subconscious mind. When a person repeatedly holds a vivid picture of a desired outcome, when they feel it, see it, and emotionally identify with it, that image begins to impress itself on the deeper mind. And the subconscious, once convinced, begins quietly guiding behavior toward that picture. One man discovered this principle while struggling with a destructive habit that had taken control of his life. For years, he had been caught in a cycle of heavy drinking. Every attempt to stop seemed to end the same way. He would make a decision to quit, rely on sheer determination for a while, and eventually find himself pulled back into the same behavior. Each failure made the habit feel stronger. Eventually, he began to believe something dangerous, that he was powerless. And that belief itself became another suggestion to his subconscious mind. The more he repeated the idea that he had no control, the more firmly the habit held its place. But then something changed. Instead of fighting the habit directly through force, he tried a different approach. He began creating a new mental picture. Every day, he set aside time to relax and enter a quiet, calm state of mind. In that relaxed moment, he imagined something very specific. He pictured his daughter greeting him at home. He imagined her smiling, congratulating him, telling him how wonderful it was to have him back as the father she loved. He replayed that scene again and again in his mind, not casually, but with feeling. He heard her voice. He saw her expression. He felt the joy of freedom from the habit that had separated them. And something remarkable began to happen. That mental picture slowly replaced the old one. Where the mind once drifted toward images of drinking and despair, it now returned to the picture of freedom and reunion. The subconscious mind began accepting that image as the new direction of life. Over time, the habit that once felt unstoppable began to weaken. Because the deeper mind had received a different instruction. It was now moving toward the image of completion rather than the image of failure. Another story illustrates the same principle from a different angle. A successful salesman suddenly found his career stalling. Deals that once seemed certain would collapse at the last moment. Opportunities slipped away again and again. At first, he blamed circumstances. Perhaps the market had changed. Perhaps clients had become more difficult. But when he looked deeper, he realized something important. A few months earlier, one client had broken a promise to sign a contract. The experience had irritated him so deeply that he began expecting the same thing to happen with others. Without realizing it, he had planted the idea of disappointment in his mind. Every new opportunity was approached with a quiet suspicion that it might collapse. And the subconscious mind, faithful to the expectation it had received, began producing exactly that pattern. The turning point came when he decided to deliberately change the mental picture. Each morning before meeting clients, he repeated a quiet affirmation to himself. He reminded his mind that intelligence and guidance were working through him, that every effort he began would move toward completion, that the work he offered would benefit others. These words were not magic. Their power came from repetition. Day after day, he impressed the new expectation on his subconscious mind. Gradually, his confidence returned. The sense of obstruction disappeared, and the pattern of successful meetings resumed. The change began not in the marketplace, but in the image he held inside his mind. This brings us to another important idea. Often the solution to a problem already exists within the problem itself. When a person faces difficulty, the mind tends to focus entirely on the obstacle. It examines the situation from every angle, sometimes becoming so absorbed in the problem that it forgets to look for the answer. But the deeper intelligence of the mind works differently. It does not simply analyze the problem, it also holds the potential for resolution. When a person assumes that guidance already exists within the subconscious mind, they begin approaching the difficulty with a new attitude. Instead of tension and frustration, they adopt expectation. They relax the mental struggle and allow the deeper mind to work. Often the answer arrives quietly. A new idea appears, a different perspective emerges. A solution that seemed invisible suddenly becomes clear. This happens because the subconscious mind responds best when the conscious mind stops forcing the outcome and begins trusting the inner process. Yet none of this works unless a person truly wants to change. There is always a turning point in the formation of a new habit. It is the moment when the desire for freedom becomes stronger than the desire to repeat the old pattern. As long as someone secretly believes they need the habit, they will continue feeding it energy. But when the desire for release becomes genuine, when the mind clearly says, "I want something better," the subconscious becomes ready to cooperate. That moment is sometimes described in a simple way. If a person desires freedom from a destructive habit more than they desire the habit itself, they are already more than halfway toward healing, because the direction of attention has changed. Instead of feeding the old track, the mind begins building a new one. Of course, the process requires patience. Old patterns rarely disappear overnight. Just as a trail through a forest becomes visible through repeated footsteps, a mental path becomes strong through repetition. But if someone keeps returning to the new image, if they continue impressing the mind with the feeling of freedom, success, or completion, the subconscious gradually accepts the new pattern as natural. And once that happens, behavior begins to change almost effortlessly. What once felt impossible now feels normal. The new track becomes the path the mind follows automatically. This is the quiet power of the subconscious mind. It records whatever we repeatedly impress upon it. If we dwell on defeat, it builds a pattern of defeat. If we dwell on success, freedom, and completion, it begins moving life toward those conditions. In the end, the mind is very much like a garden. Whatever seeds are planted consistently, fear or confidence, failure or success will eventually grow. And once we understand that, we gain a powerful ability, the ability to plant new seeds, and patiently watch a different life begin to grow. Fear has a strange way of appearing larger than life. It can arrive quietly, almost invisibly, and yet influence the way someone speaks, moves, decides, and even imagines their future. Sometimes it shows up as a hesitation before stepping onto a stage, a tightening feeling before walking into an interview, or a sudden wave of anxiety while standing in an elevator or near deep water. And what makes fear so fascinating is that in many cases, the danger itself isn't actually present. The mind has simply created a picture so convincing that the body reacts as if the threat were real. To understand fear clearly, it helps to separate two very different kinds of it. The first kind is natural. It is part of the body's built-in alarm system. When a person hears a speeding car approaching and instinctively steps away from the road, that quick burst of fear protects them. When a sudden loud noise startles someone, the body prepares itself for action. These reactions exist for survival. They are brief, immediate, and useful. But there is another kind of fear that operates very differently. This second kind does not arise from immediate danger. It grows from imagination, suggestion, and repeated expectation. Instead of appearing for a moment and then fading, it lingers. It replays scenes in the mind. It whispers possibilities of failure or disaster long before anything actually happens. And when the mind repeats those suggestions often enough, the subconscious begins to accept them as instructions. The result is what many people call destructive fear. This kind of fear can influence a person's life in powerful ways. It can convince someone that they cannot speak confidently in front of others, that they will fail an exam, even if they studied carefully, or that something terrible will happen if they travel, swim, or ride an elevator. In each case, the body reacts as if the imagined danger were real. The mind, after all, does not always distinguish between an event happening in reality and a vivid picture created in imagination. Take the example of public speaking. A person may be invited to speak at a banquet or meeting. The opportunity might even be exciting at first. But as the day approaches, the mind begins to imagine the worst possible outcome. Perhaps they picture themselves forgetting their words, hearing the audience whispering, or feeling their voice tremble. Each time that picture repeats, it becomes more convincing. The body responds accordingly. The heart beats faster. The throat tightens. By the time the moment arrives, the fear feels overwhelming. Yet the fear itself was not created by the audience. It was created by the images the mind rehearsed beforehand. This realization leads to an important insight. If fear is strengthened by repeated mental pictures, it can also be weakened by replacing those pictures with different ones. There is a simple technique that has helped many people shift their mental patterns. First, the person deliberately relaxes. They sit quietly for a few minutes and allow the body to become calm. In this peaceful state, the mind becomes more receptive to suggestion. Then they introduce a new idea. Instead of imagining failure, they begin imagining success. They picture themselves speaking clearly and confidently. They imagine the audience listening with interest. They feel the sense of calm that comes from knowing the moment is unfolding smoothly. This mental rehearsal is repeated several times a day. Gradually, the subconscious mind begins accepting the new image. And when the actual moment arrives, the mind responds differently because it has already practiced the experience internally. The same principle helped a young singer who once struggled with stage fright. She had a beautiful voice, but every time she stepped onto a stage for an audition, fear overwhelmed her. Her mind was filled with one expectation that she would fail, and because the subconscious tends to carry out the instructions it receives, that expectation shaped her performance. But instead of continuing to rehearse failure, she tried something different. Several times each day, she sat quietly and imagined herself singing beautifully. She pictured the notes flowing easily, the audience listening with appreciation, and herself feeling calm and poised. She repeated this exercise again and again. Slowly, the fear began to loosen its grip. When the next audition arrived, she stepped forward with a new inner expectation. The performance that followed was completely different from the earlier attempts. The change did not happen because the world had suddenly become easier. It happened because her inner suggestion had changed. Examinations provide another clear example of how fear can grow through repeated expectation. Many students have experienced a strange phenomenon during tests. They study thoroughly and know the material well. Yet when the exam begins, their mind suddenly goes blank. After the test ends, the answers return easily. What happened during those crucial moments? Often the cause is fear itself. If a student spends days before the exam, worrying about failure, imagining themselves forgetting everything they studied, that suggestion sinks into the subconscious mind. By the time the exam begins, the mind is already expecting confusion. The result is temporary memory blockage, not because the knowledge disappeared, but because fear interrupted the mind's ability to access it. The solution again begins with suggestion. Instead of repeating thoughts of failure, the student deliberately plants a new idea that their memory works perfectly, that the knowledge they have studied is available whenever they need it. They imagine the moment of finishing the exam successfully, and perhaps even receiving congratulations afterward. As the mind accepts this new expectation, the emotional tension fades, and when the examination arrives, the answers appear naturally. Fear also grows in places that have no real danger at all. Some people feel trapped in elevators, convinced something terrible might happen. Others feel uneasy around water even when the environment is safe. These reactions often trace back to a single past experience or a vivid mental picture that left a strong impression. A person who once became stuck briefly in an elevator may replay that memory again and again until the fear expands far beyond the original event. Another person who nearly slipped while swimming as a child may carry the memory for years, imagining the same danger repeating. But the mind can be retrained. Someone afraid of elevators might begin by sitting quietly and imagining themselves riding the elevator calmly. They picture stepping inside, feeling relaxed and arriving safely at their destination. They repeat this mental scene until it begins to feel familiar rather than threatening. When they finally ride the elevator again in reality, the mind recognizes the situation because it has already experienced it in imagination. The fear begins to dissolve. The same approach works with water. A person who fears swimming may close their eyes and imagine moving easily through the water, feeling the cool surface around them and the rhythm of their arms and legs. With repetition, the mind becomes comfortable with the image. Eventually, the body follows the new expectation. In each of these examples, fear behaves less like a physical force and more like a shadow created by attention. The more the mind concentrates on danger, the darker the shadow becomes. But when attention shifts toward confidence and successful outcomes, the shadow fades. There are also people whose fears grow from dramatic imagination about the future. Someone might read news about airplane accidents and begin picturing themselves in similar disasters. Another person might imagine losing their job or their savings even when no such threat currently exists. By repeating those scenes mentally, they gradually convince themselves that disaster is likely. Yet the events they fear may never have existed except as images in the mind. This is why one of the most effective responses to fear is to move mentally toward the opposite idea. If the mind imagines failure, replace it with a picture of success. If the mind imagines illness, picture strength and health. If the mind imagines danger, picture guidance and protection. The subconscious responds to whichever image is impressed upon it most consistently. And there is another step that completes the process. Eventually, the person must do the very thing they once feared. At first, the action may feel uncomfortable. But when the mind has already rehearsed the successful outcome, the body discovers that the experience is far less threatening than it once believed. The fear begins to shrink each time the action is repeated. This simple pattern has helped countless people regain freedom in areas where fear once controlled them. Relax the mind. Plant a new suggestion. Imagine the desired outcome clearly. Then step forward and act. Each repetition weakens the old expectation and strengthens the new one. Gradually, the mind realizes something it could not see before. Many fears were never solid obstacles at all. They were shadows kept alive by attention. And once the mind stops feeding them with imagination and expectation, those shadows quietly fade away. There is a belief that quietly settles into many minds as the years pass. It begins almost invisibly. At first, it sounds like a simple observation, people saying things like, "Well, I'm getting older now," or "Those years are behind me." But over time, that thought can turn into something heavier. A quiet expectation that life must gradually shrink, that creativity fades, that usefulness disappears, that energy and meaning belong mostly to youth. Yet when you look more carefully at the deeper nature of the mind, something surprising appears. The subconscious mind does not grow old. It does not measure life by birthdays or calendars. It does not weaken simply because the body changes. In fact, many of the most powerful qualities within a human being, love, patience, understanding, wisdom, curiosity, imagination, have no age at all. They do not wrinkle, slow down, or expire. And this reveals an important truth. What we call aging often begins first in thought. A person may still have years of vitality ahead, yet if their mind repeatedly accepts the idea that they are finished, that life has passed them by, the body and spirit gradually begin to follow that belief. It is almost as if the mind sends instructions to the rest of life: the story is over. But that story does not have to be written that way. There have been countless examples throughout history of individuals whose most meaningful work happened in the later chapters of life. Artists who produced their finest creations well past the age when society expected them to slow down. Scientists who continued exploring ideas deep into their later years. Writers who completed remarkable books after decades of experience had sharpened their understanding of the world. These people shared a common attitude. They refused to let the number of years determine the size of their possibilities. Instead, they continued feeding their minds with curiosity. They remained open to new ideas. They studied unfamiliar subjects. They explored interests that had been waiting patiently in the background while earlier responsibilities filled their days. In other words, they kept growing. And growth is the true measure of youth and spirit. Consider the person who decides that learning is finished simply because school ended long ago. The mind begins to narrow. Days start to repeat themselves in smaller circles. The excitement of discovery slowly disappears. Now imagine someone with a different attitude. They pick up a book about a subject they've never studied before. They learn a language or practice an instrument or explore a new form of art. Perhaps they begin writing down ideas that have lived quietly inside them for years. What happens inside the mind during that process is remarkable. New pathways of thought begin forming. Curiosity returns. The mind becomes active again, alive with questions and possibilities. In that moment, age becomes far less important than engagement. This perspective also transforms the way we look at retirement. For many people, retirement has been portrayed as a kind of ending. The closing chapter after which life becomes passive, quiet, and increasingly detached from meaningful work. But that interpretation misses something essential. Retirement can also be a beginning. For decades, many individuals spend the majority of their time meeting obligations, building careers, raising families, managing responsibilities that leave little room for personal exploration. Then suddenly a new chapter opens. Time appears where once there was very little, and the question arises, what will you do with it? Some people unfortunately respond by withdrawing. They begin to believe the world no longer needs their contribution, that younger generations have taken over and their role has ended. But this belief is rarely true. Experience is one of the most valuable resources a person can offer. A lifetime of lessons cannot be replaced easily. The perspective gained through years of living contains insight that younger minds often search for. When older individuals continue to share their knowledge, mentor others, explore ideas, and remain engaged with life, they enrich not only themselves, but the entire community around them. The truth is that usefulness does not disappear with age unless the mind first accepts that idea. There are people who remain intellectually vibrant and emotionally generous well into their later years because they never close the door on growth. They continue to read, write, build, teach, and encourage. Their curiosity keeps them mentally young even as the body changes. And perhaps most importantly, they maintain a sense of purpose. Purpose acts like a current running through life. It gives direction to the mind and energy to the spirit. Without it, days can begin to feel empty. But when purpose remains alive, the mind stays engaged with the world. This does not mean the later years must look exactly like the earlier ones. The pace may change. The activities may shift. But the inner life can become richer than ever before. Many people discover that with age comes a deeper appreciation for the beauty of ordinary moments. Conversations become more meaningful. Quiet reflection becomes more valuable. The wisdom gained through experience allows a person to see life from a broader perspective. This stage of life can also bring something else: freedom. Freedom from certain pressures that once dominated the earlier years. Freedom to pursue interests for their own sake rather than for approval or competition. A person who embraces that freedom often finds themselves entering one of the most creative phases of their life. There are countless stories of individuals who began entirely new ventures after the age when society expected them to slow down. Some start writing for the first time. Others travel and document their experiences. Some begin teaching what they have learned through decades of work. Others dive into artistic pursuits they once postponed. These stories share a simple message. Life does not stop offering possibilities unless the mind stops accepting them. Another important realization is that the qualities that make life meaningful are not dependent on physical youth. Love does not grow old. Kindness does not grow old. Patience, generosity, and understanding do not fade simply because time has passed. In fact, these qualities often deepen with age. The person who has lived long enough to witness both joy and hardship often develops a compassion that younger minds have not yet learned, and that compassion becomes a powerful gift to the world. When someone continues expressing these qualities, sharing encouragement, offering wisdom, supporting others, their presence brings light wherever they go. This is why the fear of aging can be so misleading. Many people worry about what they imagine the later years will take away from them, but they rarely consider what those years might give: perspective, depth, clarity about what truly matters. A person who releases fear and instead welcomes the later chapters of life often discovers something beautiful. The mind becomes calmer, the priorities become clearer, and the appreciation for life becomes stronger. It is as though the noise of earlier decades fades slightly, allowing deeper truths to become visible. The key is refusing to accept the idea that age defines the limits of possibility. Because the subconscious mind, the deeper intelligence guiding thought, imagination, and creativity, remains active and responsive throughout life. It continues generating ideas, insights, and inspiration whenever the conscious mind invites it to do so. If a person feeds that deeper mind with curiosity, gratitude, and expectation for the future, it continues producing energy and purpose. But if the mind repeatedly rehearses the belief that everything worthwhile is behind them, the subconscious begins shaping life according to that expectation. The difference lies in the direction of thought. A hopeful mind sees the later years as a time for exploration. A fearful mind sees them as a decline, yet the choice of perspective belongs to the individual. And once someone realizes that a new vision becomes possible, instead of saying, "My best years are gone," the mind begins to say something different. My experience has prepared me for deeper understanding. My years have given me wisdom that can help others. This chapter of life may hold discoveries I have not yet imagined. With that attitude, the spirit remains young regardless of age. Because youth in its truest sense is not measured by the condition of the body but by the openness of the mind. A curious mind remains alive. A grateful mind remains vibrant. A creative mind continues building new possibilities. And when someone carries those qualities forward through the years, life does not fade into silence. It expands, it deepens, and it continues offering opportunities for meaning, growth, and contribution right up to the very end of the journey. In the end, so much of life quietly follows the direction of our inner world. The thoughts we repeat become habits. Those habits shape our actions, and slowly they form the tone of our relationships, our courage, our peace, even the way we move through the years. Perhaps the real work is simply learning to guide that inner voice with a little more care. If these ideas stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on them. And if you'd like to keep exploring together, you're always welcome to return.